What would happen if terrorists detonated a nuclear device high above the United States? What about if the sun emitted a large coronal mass ejection that resulted in a damaging geomagnetic storm? In either case, electrical power could be lost for months. Shortages would quickly ensue. Food, water, and fuel would disappear within days. Widespread panic and suffering would be unavoidable. Are you prepared for these large-scale disasters? This is from the website intro to one of our next guest's books. Our guest today on Civil Defense Radio is Arthur Bradley, PhD, a NASA electrical engineer. Arthur, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me on.
My guest host today is Todd DeVoe, host of EM Weekly, a podcast targeting emergency management professionals. How you doing,
Hey guys,
Todd?
how you doing today? I'm doing well.
Okay, even though I used a bit of drama to introduce you, please tell us about yourself and how you became interested in the subject of preparedness. But first, I must admit that I've read 3 of your books: Disaster Preparedness for EMP Attacks and Solar Storms, which is where the intro came from, and Prepper's Instruction Manual, as well as the huge Handbook to Practical Disaster Preparedness for the Families. All 3 of them packed full of great information. So if you would, Arthur, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. First, let me say, when you were reading those words, I was thinking to myself, man, that's some great writing there, whoever put that together. And then at the end, I thought, hold on a second, I think I wrote that. That's so funny. But no, anyway, I got interested in disaster preparedness really back during the terrorist attacks, during the Twin Tower attacks. I remember, like most people, where I was when that happened, and it was a somber day, but I remember the feeling of not knowing what it meant, not knowing if the world was changing or, if my family was safe. And I decided that day that, I was going to become better prepared and my family would be better prepared. And so I started on that journey, really, and it's a lifelong sort of journey like most things. And I did a lot of reading and a lot of getting better prepared and learning to store the right goods and learning the right skills. And somewhere along that way, I started reading about electromagnetic pulse attacks as a threat to our nation, and solar storms the same way. And I thought, well, with my background in electrical engineering, maybe I could put a little bit of a practical, technical aspect to this that might help people get better prepared. And so anyway, that's what I've been doing. I've probably been involved in the EMP stuff for probably the last 8 or 10 years or so, and trying to help people to understand it a little better and be better prepared for it.
You say you delved into the threats. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the threats? I know your books have it in there, but you mentioned EMP and solar flares too. Is that what you were saying?
Well, yeah. So I'm a general preparer kind of guy. My view on preparedness has always been you start with the stuff that's most likely to get you first, right? So I live on the East Coast, so of course I'm worried about hurricanes and nor'easters and those kinds of things, and maybe not so much about, let's say, earthquakes and ice storms. But you start, in my opinion, you start figuring out first how you're going to weather those things that happen all the time, and then you move on to these events like an EMP or a coronal mass ejection that aren't going to happen very often, but when they do, they're very serious. They typically call those high-impact, low-frequency events. I mean, they're big when they happen, but they don't happen very often. And so, those are 2 of them, but there are many other high-impact events like that. Everything from global pandemics is one. Even something like a global stock market crash could have the sort of effect that would, fundamentally change life on our planet to some degree. And so, those are the events you do after you've got your other preparations in order. But they do take a lot of forethought to be ready for them because they affect all aspects of your life, and certainly an EMP or a coronal mass ejection would certainly do that.
What is the difference, since I mentioned EMP and CME on the intro, what's the difference between an EMP and a coronal mass ejection?
Well, of course, their mechanisms are completely different. What actually makes them occur, right? An EMP is a electromagnetic pulse, which is just what it sounds like, and it's a result of a nuclear weapon detonating in the atmosphere, which creates some gamma rays, and those gamma rays ionize the air molecules. Ionize just means you strip away the electrons, and those electrons travel down toward the planet, and they perturbate the Earth's magnetic field, if you will, and that causes these currents to flow on the surface, and they get in long conductors, And then there's also all this radiated energy that couples into all the electronics. And so that's sort of the mechanism of an EMP. And that one is really the worst of the two, because you have these two mechanisms. You have these large currents that flowing on these conductors, these really, really damaging currents, electrical currents. And then you also have this radiated emission that's coming down through the air, which can affect even electronics that aren't plugged in. The coronal mass ejection, by contrast, is really just this low-frequency disturbance that's caused by the sun. It emits a plasma, but the net effect is the same. You get this geomagnetic storm on the Earth, the surface of the Earth, that causes these long conductors to generate this current to flow in them, and that current's very damaging to anything that it's connected to. Now, the big difference is that solar storms don't have the radiated effect, so they're not going to damage anything that's freestanding. So your cars aren't going to be affected by a solar storm. Your radios aren't going to be affected, other than you might get a lot of interference on them. You're not going to blow out small electronics, like your cell phone's not going to get zapped and die from a solar storm. But what will happen is the same effect from both, is that it will very likely take down the electrical grid, and that's really where everything starts to unwind in the United States, is if the electrical grid were to go down.
That would be catastrophic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty safe say. A lot of people have made predictions over if either of these events occurred, and you said it in the intro there that what happens is these very damaging currents can essentially destroy anything that's connected to the grid, and those are things, if you start thinking through our infrastructures, they're all connected to the grid. So your water purification, food distribution, fuel harnessing, everything, emergency services, and on you go. If you take out the grid and the equipment connected to it, pretty quickly all of the dominoes start falling together. The generators run out of fuel because they can't refuel, and on it goes. People can't report to work because they're trying to figure out how to get enough water to drink, and everything kind of unwinds very quickly in a matter of days. And there's been people who have estimated that 90% of the population in affected areas would die. I'm not that pessimistic myself. I think people are clever, and they figure out how to survive, often at the expense of others. So I don't know that the death rates would be that high, but I do think it would be unlike anything we'd seen before. And so, yeah, I think it would be catastrophic, would be a fair assessment.
Well, let's say in the era of our grandparents, they were very self-sufficient, whereas today we're not as self-sufficient. We rely on that 3 days of resupply in the grocery market and pharmacies and other places, and going to Walmart. I mean, there's very little self-sufficiency going on today.
Yeah, I would agree with you. We live in this just-in-time world now, right? And it's intentional. The market system is that way, where everything that we have, we go to the grocery store and everything is just sort of arrives there days before we go and get it. There's not this, large stockpiles of anything anywhere. And if that distribution system gets taken out, everything gets depleted very quickly, and a lot of people are left with, I think they said the average was that people have less than 5 days of food in their house and no stored water. And so, yeah, you can imagine how quickly things would get dire. Go a day without any water whatsoever, and, you quickly realize that you probably shouldn't have access or you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, just go camping over a weekend.
First time, I want to jump in here for a second. In 2011, there was a Southwest blackout, and it basically started in Arizona and then moved into California, and it stopped in Orange County. And I was up in the EOC when this was going on, and Southern California Edison at the time said, we're going to turn off the power area in Tustin, and that's basically a fire break that we're creating. And if it goes past there, we might lose the entire western seaboard. And they were able to stop it there. How fragile is our grid?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I've been to a few conferences where they've talked about how fragile it is. And the grid is a complex system, right? There are the major interconnects, but within them there are all these different companies that handle the distribution of it. And so it's not like a uniform national grid. It's a very complex system. But what the data that I've seen is that a well-placed nuclear warhead over the United States could take out most, if not all, of the interconnects in the United States, just because they're not prepared. That they don't have any of the hardening technologies that they should have in them. And the same sort of projection is being made about a solar coronal mass ejection, even though there probably is technology to shut the grid down, because you have some warning of that. But very likely people would not expect even if they knew a strong storm was coming, they wouldn't necessarily think it was going to be bad enough to require shutting the grid down. And by the time they did, it would very likely be too late.
To piggyback on that question, I mean, obviously we have not just the EMP type of strikes, but we also have cyber attacks that are happening on a daily basis into the grid providers as well. So they're just looking for that one weak link, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a more likely threat, at least in day to day, is that these cyber attacks occur all the time, right? We don't hear about them a lot, and they're a lot of times they're probing attacks by the bad actors. You can name them quite easily to see where our weaknesses are, so that should the time come when they need to initiate a greater attack, they know how to get into the systems quickly and cause mayhem. And I do think we're very vulnerable to that. Now, I will say I doubt that the extent would be the same as like a nuclear EMP. It's probably not going to be a national catastrophe, but it could certainly affect major metropolitan areas or something. You can imagine, take out New York City's the power in New York City, how chaotic that would become and how quickly that would be very serious. So I do think it's a grave threat.
Well, it wasn't too long ago, 2011, or I can't remember the date, but there was the Great Eastern Blackout where a tree branch fell on a transformer and shorted it out, and the chain started, and it ended here in Virginia. The whole New York City was blacked out for like 7 days or something like that, and just chaos ensued.
2003. 2003,
that's right. Okay, yeah. So there's examples of what can happen during a blackout.
Yeah, I always tell my kids, a blackout for 2 hours is a lot of fun, but a blackout for 2 weeks is no fun at all. So
yeah,
just ask my wife when we know that we're going to have power down for maintenance. She makes sure she gets up early to take a shower to make sure she can use her hair dryer, because that's a crisis for her, right? But realistically, you start losing the power to your refrigerator and freezer, and those foods go bad quickly. And like you're saying before, the food at the grocery stores is going to go bad quickly. So power is definitely something that we expect to turn the switch on and the light's going to turn on. And I don't think that and when I say collectively, Americans know how to live without power now. There are still places in the United States back up into the 70s that didn't have power to them. They're pretty much without power, but those places are far and few between now.
Yeah, and to make matters worse is that if we had, let's say, a coronal mass ejections affect the planet in a significant way that took out the grid, the problem is that there are some folks who are fairly prepared. They say, I've got my generator, or I've got a solar-powered generation system here at the house. I'm going to make it. I'm going to be okay. But the problem with that is that those events, anything that's connected to the grid, is almost certain to experience damage. And so even though they roll out the generator and they power it up and they plug it up to the house, it's very likely that most of the things in the house aren't going to work, and that you might have overheating and those things that do. And so you have that double whammy of even the folks who have kind of thought through a backup energy source may be really in bad straits. It's one of the reasons I've been working for the last, I guess about 4 or 5 months on a surge protection system that would help families essentially protect their electronics in their homes just for that sort of emergency.
Yeah, we had that happen to us. We had a power outage. Nothing really major, and all of a sudden this power flicked back on really fast or really quick, and then it went out again. And then what it was a squirrel ate through one of the lines and just fried us, right? And then I guess he just touched it enough to where we had the higher voltage come into the house. Not just our house. It was 4 homes on the street. One of the guys who just happened to be coming home experienced his those Glade plugins. They started on fire.
Wow.
We lost, we had to bring the electrician in to fix our electrical circuits. Our next door neighbor, everything that was in her kitchen was blown out. We lost the refrigerator that was in the garage. We lost some radios and things like this that were plugged in on the surge protector. So even that little experience right there just taught me that this is a real deal. If you have something like that you're going to lose more than just power to your house.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the standard preparation has always been, you get a good quality surge protector, and there's a bunch out there, not terribly expensive, a couple $100 or something, and you install it on the home, and in general that does great for things like that crazy squirrel or a nearby lightning strike or something. That's kind of what they're designed for. The problem is with the EMP or the coronal mass ejection is there's this what they call an E3 pulse, which is a really slow, lower voltage. Maybe it's only 800 volts or something like that, way more than your house wants, but not the 50,000 volts. But that slow pulse comes into your home, and it may not be enough to cause your breakers to pull on your house, but it's most certainly enough to start damaging all the electronics. And what's bad about it is that normal surge protectors that are attached, any of them that you buy, it doesn't matter which one, they'll all get destroyed by that pulse. They're just not designed to sink that kind of long-term energy. They just cook in about less than a second for sure. And so your home ends up being left exposed anyway, even though you had a surge protector installed, which is kind of unfortunate.
So there's three pulses. There's the E1, E2, and E3. So the E1 would trip that surge protector, and then the E3 would come in, and there wouldn't be any wall behind it, or in front of it, I mean.
Yeah, it's sort of a complex study of how it would come in and affect it. So E1 is so brief, and we're talking about something with a rise time of maybe 5 nanoseconds or something. It's so brief that it's going to be, it by itself is not going to be have enough energy to blow out your surge protector, but it's certainly going to pass through the system without your surge protector is not really fast enough normally to catch it. So it's going to come in and do what it's going to do, and you're not going to stop it without some special design. And then comes the E2, which is sort of the normal, like a lightning type event. And most surge protectors actually will try and clamp that E2 down, and they may even survive it. But as E3 starts to roll in, the surge protector will quickly overheat and will fall out of the circuit, and then that energy just comes into the home completely unprotected. And it's a tricky problem to solve because most events, the squirrel on the lines and the lightning, those don't have those E3 things, and so nobody cares about them. No surge protecting companies are like, I need to design something to protect against that, which is why I undertook that. I designed a 3-stage system as an electrical engineer. I sort of took it on, and I said, I'm going to design 3 stages, one for each of these events, an E1, an E2, and E3 stages, and put it together into some kind of a product that really will protect the home from something like that. So that's kind of my mission right now.
Have you fielded that already, or is it still in testing?
Yeah, it's in testing. I take pre-orders for it. I'm only going to make 500 of them. I'm not a production company, and this is a labor of love for me. So what I've done is I post videos every couple of weeks on my progress. I got 5 videos out there right now, and I'm at the point where I've gotten through simulation. I'm a big person who believes in simulation. I simulated the circuits I designed, and then I've built a prototype, and I've shown the prototype, and I've started testing it and shown some of the tests on the video. And so far it's going really well. I'm going to build 3 more qualification units in the next 3 weeks, and then those are going to go off. I'm going to do some really extensive testing on these units, unlike anything anybody else would do because they have no reason to do them. I'm going to do military standard 461 conducted susceptibility tests on it, which are really for testing against the conductive effects of an EMP as well as lightning. So I'm going to run 3 different military standards on it to show that it would survive and how it would work. And then I'm going to have it tested by the usual methods, which is Underwriter Labs testing, where they test it for safety and effectiveness. But anyway, so all that's going to be my testing phase in the next few months, and it should be ready for production and delivery sometime in the summer.
Well, that UL testing, that's not cheap, I'm sure.
Oh my gosh, you don't even know. Yeah, I've been shopping that around. It's so funny because it's required, but it's required with a wink, right? It's one of those, if you look at products that are sold and they have a UL label on them, trust me, that costs that company maybe close to $50,000, right, for that label. But many of the companies, if you look at their boxes, it'll say something like UL 1449 compliant or tested, but you won't see the little sticker on it, right? And all that means is they weren't going to fork out $50,000. They were just going to do what they could with it and say it was compliant and sell that sucker. So yeah, it's very, very expensive to have the Underwriter Labs testing done, no doubt about it.
That's like buying something at the grocery store where it says natural and you know that it's really not that healthy.
Yeah, you just buyer beware, like all things. The problem with surge protectors, is that you just don't want something unsafe like that connected to your power system. So, it's just buyer beware, like everything.
So, what would you say to somebody who says, we don't have to worry about a geomagnetic storm, or we don't have to worry about an electromagnetic pulse? Those things are just they're like Bigfoot. They don't exist.
Yeah, we get that. I think everybody sees those stories. I get asked that routinely. Is this all just make believe and fear mongering, right? And I'm not a doomsayer at all. I'm a very practical sort of person. And so I always start with kind of the basics of, well, is this a real physical phenomenon, right? Or did somebody just make this up, right? And coronal mass ejections have been known about for almost 200 years, right? Everybody's familiar with the Carrington event, which was a really big geomagnetic storm that occurred in the 1800s, that caught the telegraph stations on fire and other things. And that's a real event. It's documented in history. Everybody knows it happens. And we have all the satellites. NASA has their satellites watching the sun. So we know when events happen. It's a question of when does a strong emission come toward Earth, and Earth just happens to be in the wrong spot and gets hit with a large one. And scientists will tell you that happens about every 150 years. That's sort of the statistical number. Well, the Carrington event was about 160 years ago. So, okay, then we're a little bit past due for something significant like that to occur. And so there are a lot of people who predict that any day something like that could indeed occur. An EMP is a harder one to predict because, it's up to our enemies to decide when something like that is initiated. And I don't think that would happen out of the blue. I think it's one of those you'd probably see a geopolitical, tensions were rising and then something might snap and that might be some kind of asymmetric attack that a company like North Korea or Iran are the two that come to mind, that could really cause the U.S. very, very serious problems, but maybe not still draw a true nuclear retaliation, right? Because they haven't killed anybody. All they did is have a cause of a bright flash up in the sky, right? And maybe caused us some infrastructure problems, but they didn't quote unquote kill anybody. So I could see that happening. Now the question is that a real event or is that something somebody made up? And that's actually been tested, I guess, back since the 50s or 60s. Most of the tests were in the 60s, where they detonated warheads over the ocean to try and keep them away from populated areas. And they measured what these fields were, and they were surprised, in fact, by how strong they were. The Russians actually did it over their own city just to see how that worked. And they caught one of their power plants on fire and some other things. And so you can go back and read the history of it, but it's a well-known physical phenomenon that occurs, and then it's just a question of whether you believe someone would actually try and do it to the United States or not.
Back in November of 2010, there was a missile or something that was launched off the coast of California, and no one has really said what it was. The Navy said they weren't out there doing anything, and sort of just kind of went away. Are the enemies of the United States trying to test something like this to actually have an operational EMP to strike us?
Well, many of our enemies already have them. Of course, Russia and China have both confirmed that they have electromagnetic pulse weapons. North Korea has threatened on several occasions to use one against the United States, openly threatened, as has Russia. But the question has always been open, I guess, of whether or not North Korea actually possesses the ability to do that. They have the launch technology, but it's not clear that they've miniaturized their warheads enough to create powerful enough nuclear device that would go in those launch vehicles. And so that one's still unknown. Although give them 5 more years, it's pretty clear they'll be there. So I think it's a viable threat is the way I always look at it.
The EMP Commission has published quite a few reports lately. They finally got them through the D-class process, and some of the things that they say in there is we don't only have to worry about the intercontinental ballistic missiles, but we have other threats that could happen where they could deliver an EMP attack on us through shooting a Scud missile up from the Gulf of Mexico.
Right, yeah, you can initiate lower altitude EMP strikes. They don't have it's a line of sight thing, right? So the higher up you go, the greater your line of sight. And to get real coverage of like the continental U.S., you have to be like at 300 miles up. You have to be pretty high up. which takes a serious rocket to get it up there. But it doesn't mean you can't take one at a lower altitude, as long as you get up high enough that you can get some of this, what they call Compton scattering. But you get this effect. You can take out, let's say you only wanted to take out, the eastern seaboard, right? Maybe you can get up high enough to detonate and cause that. And even that, one weapon over the eastern seaboard, the estimated damages were greater than $1 trillion, just to give you the benchmark.
That's some economic devastation.
Yes, it is.
That's enough that would be I don't know how many times more than what 9/11 did to us, but that was devastating economically for us too.
Right, and that's the aspect of it. In a localized area, sure, we would survive as a nation, but you're right. Economically, it would absolutely set us back. It would fundamentally change our economics for a great period of time. I mean, it would take quite a while to recover. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Do you think a shipborne missile could do that?
I think it could probably do a low-altitude detonation like that. I don't know if it would take out an eastern seaboard, but it might take out a major city. And there are directed EMP weapons as well. They've been around for some time now. And again, they're much more localized. They're meant for things more like taking out a particular city or a particular base. But again, if you could, even at that, it's sort of like the dirty bomb effect, right? If you could detonate something like that and take out Chicago or New York City or Los Angeles, even that one impact, and where you can't just turn back on power, right? You've damaged the infrastructure there, right? That is enough to cause that sort of underlying fear, and which is, of course, what somebody would be after, right? That disruption and fear to our entire nation. Even though people that weren't affected would feel that, right? And I think that would be their intent.
Well, a Scud missile goes over 1,000 miles, so if they launch one from a freighter, which we've confiscated some that were on a North Korean ship that was going through the Panama Canal some time ago, if they were just happened to be nuclear tipped, then it could do that, correct?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with their altitude. I think they go maybe up to 100 miles or something like that. So it's high enough that it can get above the source region, which is like the 30-mile region or so. So it certainly could cause an EMP, but again, only if you could shrink the warhead enough to fit it into that Scud missile and get it to go off. Some countries have that ability, some don't. Of course, it's not publicly known who has exactly what.
What other threats do we have out there besides these electromagnetic threats?
Oh, you mean just in terms of our general threats, things that keep me up at night, that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
The one that keeps me up more than any other, and I know I spend a lot of time in EMP and stuff, is really more a global pandemic. That's probably the one that, if I had to put my money on, I'm at the roulette wheel, which one is likely to really fundamentally change the planet. I think a global pandemic would probably be where I put my money. And the reason is that, there's so many close calls we've had, historically, and of course some of them have hit us and we didn't escape them. Things like smallpox, for example, where hundreds of millions of people died. And then there are some that we just barely dodged because they didn't quite mutate the way we hoped they didn't, and I'm thinking of things like avian flu. But if things, mutate just the wrong way and they start becoming airborne, and they have a long shelf life, if you want to call it that, a period of time where people sort of have it and don't know it, it's already spread all around the world. We just live in that world now. And it's already spread before people start getting sick, right? And there really is no containing it at that point. There's no way to isolate it. It's just going to happen. And there's no way you develop a vaccine in time. It would just be those who survive, and the lucky don't catch it. And I think fundamentally that could happen to us, to all of us, in our lifetimes. I mean, I think it's a real threat, and something to keep in mind. There's a laundry list of other worries, but that one, at least one that comes to my mind when I start thinking of very serious ones.
So the Ebola problem over in Africa, you don't think that that's a problem?
Well, I actually wrote a little booklet on it when that happened. What was that, 2 or 3 years ago now? When it was getting a little out of control, and we had reports of a few Americans affected, and people were coming back to the United States with it. And
I remember that.
And I remember that, right?
Yeah.
And I got concerned. Of course, I got concerned. And the reason was that it's the old saying, when Arnold Schwarzenegger gets on TV and says, you don't have anything to worry about, you better start worrying, right? Right? And that's such a classic. That's exactly what was happening is emergency defense people were, saying, there's nothing to worry about. But then you started asking a lot of questions, and, well, maybe there is a little something to worry about, right?
Right.
It was a bad way to go, too. Now, the good news was, to catch Ebola as we understood it, you had to come into contact with, some form of bodily matter, usually blood or something like that, stool or something, and contract it that way, right? And that we don't handle other people's blood that often or other people's, bodily fluids. And so it's not an easy thing to spread. Now, whether that could change, and mutate in some way, I have no idea. I'm not a virologist, but it's scary. I'll tell you what, I had my little Tyvek suits and my gloves and my little masks and things, and I thought, well, if it gets really out of hand, you still have to function. You still have to go to the store. You still got to get food. You still got to function, and you ought to have some preparations in order. So, yeah, I took it seriously at the time for sure.
Well, you talk about having the protective equipment and people needing to go to the store. If they're not prepared, which majority of Americans are not prepared, then there's a problem because they're there, they're at home, they're afraid to leave, they don't have any food, they don't have any water, or maybe they still have water, but how long are the services going to run if people are staying home because they're afraid to go out?
Yeah, no, exactly right. Exactly right.
I think this is a good segue into your handbook on preparedness and all the great things you have in there. Can you go into some of the things that you've written about where what's a disaster preparedness plan? What kind of things should you be looking at? What stages are there? What categories of things should you consider in your plan and all that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a good couple-hour talk. I'll give you the shoestring version. I do go and give the talks on family preparedness, and I'll tell you, it is a really interesting talk because you get a lot of audience interaction and storytelling. People telling you about things they've experienced, and but what I always try and tell people, like we said earlier, you think about what you're worried about. You start off by making a list of what is it that keeps you up at night? What's worrying you, and what do you think is a threat to you and your family? And that's where you start. And then you figure out, well, all right, now I know what's worrying me. What are the impacts of those things? What's going to happen? Am I going to be able to get food? Am I going to be able to get water? Is my house going to be okay? And all of the other things, right? We're going to be able to stay warm. And you think about your basic needs. And I go through this in the handbook. And it's a handbook of practical disaster preparedness. I think the title kind of says it. But you go through these needs and you say, which of these needs is affected? Is my food supply affected? Is my water supply affected? And so forth and so on. Is my electricity going to be operational? And you sort of make this plan, right? And you say, okay, yeah, these things might be affected, and this is how they're going to be affected. And then you take the third piece of that is you say, well, what steps can I take that will mitigate the impact that event on me? And maybe for many people that's like, well, if my food's going to be affected, I should probably store some food, right? Some shelf-ready food. Shelf-stable food that I can eat, and I don't have to worry about cooking, perhaps.
I'm going to be a prepper.
Yeah, and you have to watch out if people start calling you names. That's part of it, though, right? Is there are the shows of the doomsday preppers and things which are fun, but it doesn't mean that people who take a realistic approach have to fall into that trap, right? You don't have to go that far down the road to think about practical preparedness. Having more than 3 to 5 days of food in your house and having maybe a way that if your water did get shut off or was declared unsafe to drink because of flooding or something, that you could make it for a while, that you could okay, well, at least we're not going to die. We have some method, maybe a storage tank of water or some kind of filtration system or something. And those are those preparations. That's that third phase where you just sort of logically make a few preparations to address those impacts, right? And that together, that's what I call a disaster preparedness plan. And in the book, that's what I do. For each of the chapters, I do an example of what a plan might look like that addresses, let's say water or food or electricity or communications or whatever those needs might be. And in a what I hope is a logical way. And the reason I did that, it's funny, I started my sort of journey down this path by reading everybody's book that's out there. I read every disaster preparedness book out that you could find. And they were, a lot of them were good, some pretty good stuff in them, but nobody really had like a plan. And I was like, well, what do I do? How do I start? And so that's what I tried to do a little differently, was kind of make it more into like a logical plan people could follow. And that's what the handbook is. It's a big book, 400 and something pages, big pages of stuff, lots of pictures and tables and things. I tried to make it fairly friendly to read, where you wouldn't just like, it's not just page after page of text or something like that. Keep your attention in it a little bit. But anyway, so that's kind of the book as a whole. I'm happy to tell you about any details on it.
That's really great because, these things actually really happen. I mean, take a look at Hurricane Sandy, where people were eating out of a dumpster a couple of days into the event because they didn't have any food in their house. And then today, I was just reading about Montgomery County in Ohio, where there's a boil water advisory going on right now. And so these things happen, so it's not just this doomsday prepper on TV or this abstract thing that's going to occur. You have to be ready for those daily things that can happen anyway. So I think somebody who's interested in this should buy your book and start to learn.
Yeah, and it's always funny. I'm sure everybody's had the same experience. Every time there's a threat of any sort, bad weather, ice storm, hurricanes, whatever's coming, there's the old, what we call the French toast syndrome in my house, where everybody rushes to the grocery store, right? And they buy eggs and they buy milk and they buy bread, right? Hey, they're making some French toast, I'm sure of it. And of course they buy water and stuff too, but batteries and water, I guess, are the other two common ones. And the point is that, that panic, that mad rush the night before, is not the scenario you want to be in. And certainly not for events that might come upon you suddenly, right? And I share a story with people of how it's usually not one thing going wrong that gets you. It's usually two things or more right together that get you. And I'll give you an example. And this is a true story. When I first moved to Virginia, and this was back in 2003, we had Hurricane Isabel. Now, I'd never been through a hurricane before, but we had Hurricane Isabel come right across where I live, okay? And I remember they said, there's a Category 2 hurricane off the coast. You've got to get out of this area, right? And I thought, well, okay, that sounds like a good idea. We should get out of here. So we waited, but I had a lot of things to do that seemed important at the time, right? They seemed, I got to do this at work, and I got to do that. We'll get out, don't worry about it. And so I kind of waited too long. And then I thought, well, we still got time. The skies are churning above me now, right? But I'm thinking, we still got time. We get in the car, and we start down the road, just pulling out of the driveway, and the car dies.
Oh, no.
I can't believe it. I'm like, what the? Right? Battery's dead. No reason for it to be dead other than God was telling me a lesson, right? And the car's dead. I couldn't believe it. So now I'm sitting there with my wife and young kids with a vehicle that's not running, and I'm like, major serious weather coming at me. So we had a second vehicle. Said, okay, it's a little bitty Ford Ranger. So it's a little bit pickup. So we pile into this Ford Ranger, right? 5 of us piled into this little Ford Ranger, and we start down the road. And now we're getting a little panicked, right? Because the skies are dark and the winds are howling, and we're like the only knuckleheads on the road, okay? We get a flat tire.
Oh, no.
I'm not kidding you. Okay, so now, my heart's pounding, right? And I'm off to the side of the road, don't have a spare, right? Completely unprepared for this event, right? And our goose was cooked. We were in trouble. And we had a guy, no joke, who just happened to come upon us. Old guy, sort of a curmudgeon-y sort of fella, pulled over, old beat-up truck, folks having some trouble, that sort of thing, right? And he saved us. He had a little spare and took our tire off, helped me get it off and get another one on, and we got on our way. But it was one of those lessons you only learn once. And I learned that, and I'll tell you, I'll never be caught like that again. But the message I came away with is not only about being prepared, it's usually not just the one thing you're prepared for. You got to think about what goes wrong when I implement that, and what could go wrong next. And you got to be ready for some of that, or you're going to be in trouble.
Yes, definitely. The guy helped you out, and you guys made it to where you had to go, or was it just too late and you went back home, or what?
No, we did. We managed to escape the area. I had a brother who lived inland about 2.5 hours, and so we went to his house, and thankfully, it was a safe place to be. Now, of course, he lost power almost immediately, and there's, it's one of those weird things again where he hadn't thought through his preparedness either, and his water was from a water well. His water required electricity to extract because it came from an electric pump.
Right.
And so he had no water in the house. And of all of the things, not having water was terrible, right? Because you couldn't flush the commodes, you couldn't have fresh water to drink. I mean, he had a little bit of bottled water, but not much. And so we found ourselves out, I remember it very clearly, early in the morning, about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning maybe, driving around the city. He lived in Charlottesville. And we were driving around the city trying to find a way to get water, right? All bottled water had been snatched up long before. And we ended up at a Lowe's, believe it or not, in the garden center of a Lowe's. You can't make this stuff up, right? We're in the garden center of a Lowe's, and there's these big spigots that they use to water the plants. I guess they hook hoses to them or something. And sure enough, they let us bring some 5-gallon buckets in and use those spigots to fill water. And we did that, and we filled up about, 30 gallons of water or so and took it back to the house. And that got us through that day. And when the worst of the weather was gone, we managed to come back home. But yeah, it was quite an experience. I will say that.
And that was the beginning of your understanding of what preparedness is.
It was a reality check. Let me put it that way. I had already become interested in preparedness at the time, but I was in sort of that research phase. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Where you're doing a lot of thinking about preparedness, and maybe doing a little fine tuning with your handguns or something. But I hadn't really thought about, real practical preparedness, which is like being ready for the stuff that is coming for you, and not being one of those, unlikely folks that either die in a house fire or, get caught in a vehicle that's submerged underwater because you were ahead and drove into some moving water. Knowing the things not to do, putting in place some basic preparations that will save you 95% of the time. And that was sort of a reality check that said, slapped me pretty good and said, hey, you need to start putting in practice what you're really looking at. And I did. And I think we've come a long way since then.
Yeah. Well, it's good for individuals and families to be prepared and expect the unexpected. But what do you think about the people in your neighborhood during a disaster? Maybe not an evacuation because they're getting out of Dodge just like you were. But what about in some of these other things like a pandemic or electromagnetic disturbance that knocks out the grid? What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because as a God-fearing Christian, I guess I feel like it's everyone's duty to look out for each other, right? But there's an asterisk with that, right? Which is my family always comes first, and so we've gone to the trouble to store water and to store some food and to have a way of generating electricity and so forth. And if things, got rough, and there's been a couple of times in there, but we've had some natural disasters that, got a little bit dicey. I'm perfectly willing to help others, if they need some help. And most of these events are short-lived, a few days and things are kind of back to where you can recover. But in a scenario where, it's not going to be a few days, right? And there's no known certain end date. This isn't like next week we know we're good. This is like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's going to happen next week or next month. Then you have to think about it. You really have to consider, is my family am I essentially trading my family's survival to help someone else? And that's a tough call. I think it's something you have to be there at the time to decide what to do about. I will say that I think people are much, much safer if they can get with some like-minded folks, right? So a network of folks. I call it a disaster preparedness network, but it's really just folks who understand just like you that, yeah, we should probably be ready for hard times and we're going to work together to get through them, right? Maybe somebody says, hey, I got, all kinds of water storage, and another person says, hey, I got a pantry full of, food that enough to eat for a month for all of us. And like, for example, one of my neighbors recently moved, but he's an ER doc. He's an emergency room doctor. And hey, that's a valuable skill.
Oh, yeah.
Should things get dicey, right? And so my view with him was always, you bring the skill, I've got some supplies, right? I can't replace your skills, right?
Yeah.
But I can keep your kids fed. And so we had that kind of understanding. My other neighbor has a big swimming pool, which of course we swim in the summer, which is nice. But more importantly, if push came to shove, we could use that water to flush the commodes and those sorts of things. And so there's some value there. And having an understanding with your neighbors, even if they're not fully on board, understanding where their value, they bring some value to you, and you have some, maybe you guys could work together to get through these tough times. I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot to be said for that. If you look back at like Hurricane Katrina is a good example. The folks who did best were the folks who gathered together, right? And they gathered together and said, this is our boundary. This is us. We're looking out for each other. So those people who are looking for crimes of opportunity, go look elsewhere, because we're kind of a unified front, and we're a dangerous entity, right? We're not going to be easily taken advantage of. And there were several examples of that. And I think that worked well, both from personal defense as well as looking out for each other for their health and safety. So I think there's a lot of value. The takeaway to me is, being a part of something, there's a lot of value to it. And it's nice to also think about, those that can't help themselves, an elderly neighbor or something like that. But it does, at some point, it becomes, a real struggle, a real moral question of how far your responsibility goes towards others.
Yeah. Well, since 9/11, there's been quite a few people who have called for a renewal of civil defense. And my research has led me to Civil Defense Radio and the concept of civil defense, because you can't be an island in a disaster. Like you said, if you have food and nobody else does, they're going to be knocking on your door. So then you got a moral dilemma in front of you. But if you are organized with your neighborhood, then your neighborhood is stronger, and you have that resiliency to weather minor storms as well as the more major.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a guy I met, I don't know, it's probably been a year or two back, a guy named Mike Mabee. I don't know if you've ever had him talk to him or not, but he's a civil defense community organizer, would be the way I would describe him. He's got a book out, a really nice guy. You ever get a chance to talk to him, he has some really strong stories and beliefs about, helping communities get back to that. A lot of us don't even know our neighbors' names anymore. It's one of those things. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh, yeah.
It used to be communities were connected. There was just a lot of connectedness. And you would even if you didn't like your neighbors, you knew your neighbors.
Right.
You knew their kids. You watched them grow up, right?
Yeah.
And some of that's been lost. A lot of us have just sort of retreated, into our own little worlds. And I think one of his missions is to see communities come together more in a civil defense way, in a way that we're all going to look out for each other. And anyway, I'm a big believer in that too. It hasn't been my personal calling. My calling was a little bit different, but
right.
But I really respect that. I think it's great.
Yeah, we each have our part, but both Todd and I both know Michael Mabee. Matter of fact, he's a good friend of mine, and his book, actually his first book, was the impetus to me starting the nonprofit that I have called Civil Defense Virginia. And it's an organization that its mission is to help grassroots organizations in cities and counties get started with a civil defense program in their jurisdiction. That's
awesome. I didn't know you knew him. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
It's a small world, huh?
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Actually, that question about Michael Mabee kind of made me. I laughed out loud today. I'm like, yeah, I had him on my show too on EM Weekly. So yeah, he's a great guy, very knowledgeable. Yeah, so it's a good thing it's a nice thing that we're all on the same page when it comes to Michael Mabee.
Yeah.
Before we let you go, and this is the question I always like to get out to everybody. If you could tell somebody 3 skills they should have to be ready, what are those 3 skills they should have?
Oh, skills. You caught me unprepared. Let me think. Well, you know what? Probably the first thing that comes to mind is learn to be a really good communicator with people. If I'm not, the people I've always seen as doing the best in any situation are the ones that know how to work other people, right? And I know that's a weird skill. You're thinking of something like fire starting or whatever, right? But that ability to be in a situation with strangers, perhaps, or maybe not strangers, maybe people you kind of know, and be able to get an outcome where everybody's willing to work together and not go home and board up their doors. That takes some effort, and you can't just do it on the day that the emergency hits. You have to learn to work with people to get sort of good communication and good trust and build those relationships. To me, that's an important skill. It's an odd one, I'm sure. I think a second one might be like emergency first aid. I think that's an obvious one. But I just can count the times that my life has been disrupted where, my heart's pounding and I'm watching my kid, not breathing, and I'm thinking what I'm trying to remember of my first aid. And so that to me is a very critical skill as well. And the third one, it wouldn't be like, a lot of people might say like hunting for food and things like that. I think it's more general. It would be, learning to kind of the MacGyverism. You know what I mean? Everybody remembers the old show MacGyver, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where, yeah, and I had a neat thing in my book. I made it up. It's neat to me. When it's something I call the survivalist. You might remember that. You remember the book,
yeah.
right?
I got it right here.
And I made that up. Yeah. And it's just kind of it reminded me to think that way, which was the survivalist idea was the stock part of it was a stockpiler, right? Somebody who stockpiles goods, right? And I would ask people this question in these meetings I do. I'd say, all right, which would you rather be, the stockpiler, right, or the MacGyver of things, the guy that could do anything, right? You give him a pack of chewing gum and a roll of duct tape, he can rig anything, right? Or would you rather be the last one, the survivalist guy, right? The guy that could find some grubs in the stump and build a heater out of a roll of toilet paper and a coffee can, right? And you get different answers, right? People would say, I would rather be this one or this one because of this reason. And what I was trying to emphasize at the end is the way you really get strong is if you're the stockpivalist, right? You can have a little bit of all of it. And developing that balanced sort of, I know a little bit about everything, and I know how to, I know what I need to keep and what I don't need to keep. And to me, that's kind of the root of true preparedness, is sort of being able to adapt in that way.
That's a really good answer, to be honest with you, because you're absolutely right. Some of the skills, especially communication, because if you can communicate well, you can almost talk yourself out of danger, as far as that goes. And then, then the idea also of, obviously first aid makes sense, but then the idea of being somebody who understands what to keep, what not to keep, you're not hoarding, but you're making sure that you have stuff, and you're not only just stocking of equipment, but you're also stocking of skills. So that's a really strong answer.
Yeah, and it's useful. Your toolbox is broad, and you can use it in everyday life as well as during emergencies.
Yeah, that's right. Because hopefully emergencies don't hit us every day, right? But that mindset of just sort of adapting and being prepared and being able to make do with what you have, that's what you every day, right? No matter what's happening. And I think it benefits and helps you all the time.
Well, Arthur, it was a pleasure having you on the show, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Todd as well. We'd love to have you back again, and it was just such a pleasure having you, and especially having read your books and being a fellow Virginian. I hope to meet you sometime soon.
Yeah, sounds great. I really appreciate coming on your show, and I thought we had a good discussion, too. Thanks a lot for that.
Pleasure talking to you.
You too.